In the spring of 1815, the political landscape of Europe was finally settling down after decades of bloodshed. Napoleon Bonaparte had been defeated at Waterloo, and the Bourbon monarchy was restored to the throne of France. As part of the peace treaties, Great Britain agreed to return several colonial territories to France, including the port of Saint-Louis in the West African territory of Senegal. To reclaim the colony, the French government assembled a small naval flotilla, led by a 44-gun frigate called the Medusa. The Medusa was packed with over 400 people. Her passenger list was a cross-section of French society, including the newly appointed governor of Senegal, Julien-Désiré Schmaltz, his family, a contingent of colonial administrators, scientists, engineers, and a battalion of soldiers. But the fatal flaw of the expedition was not the ship or the weather. It was the man placed in command of the entire fleet. Captain Hugues du Roy de Chaumaret was a loyal royalist who had fled France during the French Revolution. As a reward for his political loyalty to the newly restored king, he was given command of the Medusa. However, Chaumaret had barely set foot on a ship in over 20 years, and he had absolutely no experience commanding a modern, fast frigate. From the moment the Medusa left port on June 17, 1816, the captain's arrogance and incompetence put the ship in danger. Desperate to make a fast passage and impress the governor, Chaumaret ordered the Medusa to break away from the rest of the convoy. He wanted to cut corners and sail closer to the African coast, ignoring the seasoned junior officers who repeatedly warned him that the waters were notoriously dangerous and poorly charted. The captain dismissed his officers' concerns and instead placed his trust in a civilian passenger named Antoine Richefort, who falsely claimed to be an expert navigator of the African coast. On July 2, 1816, the inevitable happened. The water rapidly changed color from deep blue to muddy brown, indicating a sudden drop in depth. Before the crew could react, the Medusa violently ground to a halt. The captain had steered the massive warship directly onto the bank of Arguin, a huge shallow sandbar roughly 30 miles off the coast of modern-day Mauritania. For 3 days, the crew desperately tried to free the ship. They threw heavy cannons overboard to lighten the load and tried to use the high tides to float the frigate free, but the Medusa was firmly stuck in the mud, and the hull began to crack under the pounding waves. Realizing the ship was doomed, the governor and the captain made the decision to abandon her. This is where incompetence turned into absolute monstrosity. Like the Titanic a century later, the Medusa did not carry nearly enough lifeboats for everyone on board. The 6 available boats could safely carry roughly 250 people. To solve the mathematics of survival, the elite passengers devised a horrifying plan. The governor, his family, the captain, and the senior officers took the seaworthy lifeboats for themselves. For the remaining 147 people, mostly common soldiers, sailors, and a few unlucky civilians, a massive raft was hastily constructed from the ship's dismantled masts and timber. The raft was monstrously impractical. It measured roughly 65 feet long and 23 feet wide, but it had no steering mechanism, no oars, and no mast for a sail. The plan was for the 6 lifeboats to tie a tow rope to the raft and row in a line, dragging the massive wooden platform to the African shore, which was only a few dozen miles away. On July 5th, the evacuation began. As soon as the 147 people stepped onto the raft, it immediately sank 3 feet underwater under their combined weight. The passengers were packed so tightly that they could not sit down, forced to stand shoulder to shoulder in the freezing ocean water. To make matters worse, in the chaos of the evacuation, the raft was only provisioned with a single bag of waterlogged ship's biscuits, 2 casks of fresh water, and 6 barrels of wine. The lifeboats began to tow the raft, but progress was painfully slow. The massive, submerged wooden structure acted like an anchor, holding back the boats. Within a few hours, the tow rope suddenly went slack. Whether the rope snapped under the strain or was intentionally cut by the terrified officers in the lifeboats remains a subject of historical debate, but the result was the same. Captain Chaumares and Governor Schmaltz rowed away, abandoning 147 people to the mercy of the Atlantic Ocean. What happened over the next 13 days on the raft of the Medusa is one of the most harrowing survival stories in human history. On the very first night, a powerful storm blew in. The massive waves crashed over the submerged raft, violently throwing people against the jagged wooden beams. The passengers at the edges of the raft desperately fought to push their way to the center, which was slightly more elevated. In the ensuing panic and darkness, dozens of people were either swept overboard or crushed to death beneath the feet of their desperate companions. When the sun rose on the second day, 20 people were already dead. By the third day, the situation devolved into pure madness. The single bag of biscuits was gone, and the 2 casks of fresh water had been lost overboard during the nighttime struggles. The only liquid left on the sun-baked raft was the wine. Intoxicated, dehydrated, and driven insane by the salt water and the relentless sun, a group of soldiers decided their situation was hopeless. Believing that death was inevitable, they mutinied against the few junior officers and civilians on the raft, intending to destroy the structure and end their suffering. A brutal, bloody battle erupted on the slippery, sinking logs. Men fought each other with knives, bayonets, and bare hands. Those who were wounded were simply pushed off the edge into the shark-infested waters. By the end of the 4th day, the population of the raft had been reduced to just 67 survivors. Starvation soon became a greater threat than violence. As the bodies of the dead piled up, the survivors crossed the ultimate psychological threshold. Led by a ship's surgeon named Henri Savigny, the starving men began to cut the flesh from the corpses of their fallen crewmates. They initially tried to dry the human meat in the sun, but hunger soon forced them to consume it raw. It was a horrifying, traumatic choice, but it provided the protein necessary to keep the remaining men alive for a few more days. By the 8th day, only 27 people were still breathing. Most of them were severely wounded, delirious, or dying of gangrene. The 15 strongest survivors, including Surgeon Savigny and an engineer named Alexandre Coreard, calculated that the remaining wine would not last if they continued to share it with the dying. In a chilling act of ruthless maritime triage, the 15 relatively healthy men made the decision to execute the 12 weakest. They threw their sick and wounded companions into the ocean, saving the remaining rations for themselves. For 5 more days, the 15 survivors drifted under the scorching African sun. They were covered in salt sores, their skin burned, their minds shattered by the violence and cannibalism they had committed. Then, on the morning of July 17th, 13 days after being abandoned, they spotted a tiny white speck on the horizon. It was the Argus, a smaller ship from the original French convoy. The Argus was not actually looking for the raft. It had been sent back by the governor merely to see if it could salvage some gold coins that had been left behind on the wreckage of the Medusa. By sheer, blind luck, the ship stumbled across the drifting platform. The rescue crew was completely horrified by what they found. 15 emaciated, sun-scorched men, barely recognizable as human beings, standing ankle-deep in water amongst the butchered remains of their crewmates. When the survivors were brought back to France, the government attempted to completely cover up the disaster. They did not want the incompetence of a royalist captain to embarrass the newly restored monarchy. But Surgeon Savigny and Engineer Coreard refused to be silenced. They wrote a brutally honest, detailed account of the shipwreck, the abandonment, the mutiny, and the cannibalism. The book leaked to the press, and it caused an absolute sensation. The public outrage was massive. It forced the French military to place Captain Chaumareys on trial. Despite the fact that his incompetence had caused the deaths of over 100 people, he was only sentenced to 3 years in prison, a verdict that further enraged the French public. The story of the Medusa would likely have faded into the footnotes of naval history, if not for a young, ambitious artist named Théodore Géricault. Géricault was obsessed with the tragedy. He interviewed Savigny and Correard, built a scale model of the raft in his studio, and even visited morgues and hospitals to study the color of decaying flesh so he could accurately paint the dead. In 1819, he unveiled a massive, horrifyingly realistic oil painting titled The Raft of the Medusa. The painting shocked the world and cemented the tragedy into the global consciousness. Today, it hangs in the Louvre in Paris, an immortal reminder of the catastrophic cost of arrogance and the dark, terrifying lengths to which humanity will go to survive.